Today we're visiting Ashby De La Zouche Castle. It's a very grand ruin, but it really is totally ruined. It was destroyed in the English Civil War because they were loyalists to the king. Reminds me a bit there of the much more grand Corfe Castle down in Dorset. The castle itself was given to William Hastings, who was the first Baron Hastings, till he died in 1483. He was a York royalist during the War of the Roses. He was Chancellor for and a close favourite of Edward IV. And in 1473, he was given 3,000 acres for a park, obviously a hunting park, and he knocked down the old manor house and built himself a castle. So he started on the castle in 1473, but 10 years later he was yet to complete it, and he was executed by Richard III. The family finished off the castle and they built some beautiful grounds and they kept it as their seat. That's the house at which they're based, the family house. But by the English Civil War, they hadn't picked the right side, and Henry became a royalist commander in the Midlands. Well, it didn't go too well, and Parliament decreed that it had to be slighted, so demolished after a long siege. Two of the towers had been badly damaged with gunpowder, and they undermined it, so they dug mines under the wall and set fire to the wooden supports so that the weight of it would tip. And it was turned into a new house, and members of the Hastings family lived there for a very long time, until they moved to Donington Hall, which was built in the 1790s. Today you can walk through the ruins. It's an English heritage site, so it's very well looked after. There's a small shop. This is the chapel. It was quite a decent sized church for a family home of a castle. So certainly a family of very high standing. And although they never quite regained the affection that Edward IV had held for them, they did very well for themselves. Here's this interesting structure. There's steps down next to one of the towers, and at the bottom is a tunnel. So in this storeroom, during the siege, they built a tunnel, and they dug and bricked the walls all the way along here so that they could get past the attackers and move between parts of the building. It's quite odd. This corridor with its lights like that feels more like the tunnels at Dover than a Civil War era structure built during a siege. And it was a pretty heavy siege. They didn't mess around. They used gunpowder and cannonballs, and they undermined, which was really quite a time-consuming process. If you want to see how well that worked, go to Rochester Castle. In Rochester Castle, they have an entire tower fell off from undermining during the Barons' Revolt. Now we come up these much more modern stairs and we're out into the garden. By the tower. And these gardens would have been beautiful and landscaped. Today there's just two lower portions where you could see the outline of what would have been a very pleasant pleasure garden here. So there would have been gardens inside of these. Think landscaped Renaissance Italian garden for the lady of the house to walk around and sun herself. And where rich and royals would have come and enjoyed the palace when they were in the Midlands, because keeping a house like this is all about having the right friends and influence. In 1819, Sir Walter Scott's famous novel Ivanhoe featured the castle, and suddenly it became known again. It had been a forgotten ruin. It was lived in, it was maintained, but it wasn't a full-blown castle anymore. But in 1819, when Ivanhoe was published and became a bestseller, the ruins were opened to visitors, and that helped pay for restoration. Right the way through till 1932, visitors would come, stay here, visit the gardens, and they built walls around it and these little towers in the corner which are now ruined. But by 1932, the Rawdon family had really run out of the money, because it's no mean feat to maintain a building of this size, especially when it's been open to the elements for so long. And they really couldn't keep it going anymore. So it passed over to the Ministry of Works. Ministry of Works it's a government department which was floated off and became English Heritage. So that's why English Heritage has so many castles, old forts, structures that were government owned or royal owned, that really are protected for the nation and the world by English Heritage. It's a really good example of a late medieval castle, and it's got a fascinating history around the siege and around the friendships and glad handing that earned them money to keep this going, because it really is no mean feat to get permission to build a castellated structure, which has to come from a king, and then to build something as large as this and maintain it whilst navigating the War of the Roses, the Civil War, and you could argue they failed on those. Quite a testament to the castle that it's still standing like this. I mean, really, it's best to think of it as a large decorated manor house with fortifications, but the tower is still actually accessible. Not this one, no. There's two towers. One was too damaged by the siege. It's not safe to go up, so it's barred off there, the main tower. But you can still climb the lesser tower. And unfortunately, the day I visited was very misty, so the view is terrible from the top. But if we make our way through here and up to the top, you'll see a really beautiful, well, probably not from that, but you can see the defensive positions, the arrow slots, and you can see how misty it is. But it stood the test of time. Really, a lot of this structure goes back to 1280s. A lot of it from the 13th, 14th century. But it's still here. And in pretty good condition. And it's actually a manned English heritage site. So there's always a difference between those where there's people and those where there isn't. And you get slightly better facilities, and sometimes you have a walking tour, and it was a nice tour that explained everything here. And not as empty as I expected, actually. Sometimes you go to abbeys or old castles where they're not in, the top 30, and nobody really goes, and you're walking around an empty field. Whereas actually on a weekday there was about 6 groups of people walking around. And here, this is sealed off, but this is the main chapel, and you can make out where the balcony was supported. So the family would have been up in the balcony viewing it, so they could see Mass without all the plebs getting in the way. But a beautiful grounds. It's a shame the garden's not here, but really, without repairing the castle, which would ruin it, there's probably not a point in having the gardens here. You can imagine the Civil War. Ashby De La Zouche was pretty important to the royalist strategy, as it gave access to the River Trent. And Henry used the castle, that's Henry Hastings, who was a royalist commander for the Midlands. He used it to his base of operations and protected it with smaller outposts out at Donington and Shardlow. Donington's about 20 miles away, near where the A50 meets the M1, and this is just west of the M1, so not too far from each other. But they actually demolished a lot of buildings in the town of Ashby De La Zouche and used the stone and wood from that to refortify the castle and the town. Dug tunnels, so they had what was called an Irish fort, which is like an underground fort of tunnels, so they had fallbacks. But in 1643, Parliament besieged Newark, and Ashby, they sent the garrison to relieve Newark. And at that point, it all went a bit wrong. Because by late 1644, the king was losing, Parliament was getting stronger, and they'd based themselves quite near to the castle. King Charles came by in May 1645 on his way to besiege Leicester. But just a month later, he was defeated at the Battle of Naseby. And running from that battle, King Charles actually stayed the night as he retreated west. By now, really, the royalists had lost. It must have been a funny evening having the king come to visit and knowing that you were damned by helping him, that you'd basically lost the war. And there was a bit of a respite because plague broke out and the besiegers had to go back to Leicester. But as soon as the plague went and the epidemic passed, Parliament started raiding the town and forcing a surrender. And they actually surrendered on good terms. So the initial siege had failed, the siege had caused a lot of the damage. But it didn't matter, because as soon as they signed a deal and the garrison handed over their weapons and were allowed to leave, the royalists had lost. But May 1648, a royalist rebellion broke out down south, and Parliament was concerned that Henry Hastings was going to reoccupy Ashby De La Zouche and be a thorn in the side again. And at that point, Parliament decided they'd had enough, and they demolished the castle, and that's where you get the ruin today. Now, just round the corner from the church, as a little bonus, is a beautiful old church. Very mixture of styles. You can see that it's evolved and grown over time, and part of the church is probably 18th century. Some of the church is much older. Although it looks much more recent from the outside, the core of the church actually dates from 1474 and was built by William Hastings, or rebuilt by him at that point. And it was refurbished in 1670. But a lot of the fabric is still there. One of the things I found really interesting is when you go down by the altar, at the side chapels, there are burials of the Hastings family. And was also the only time I can think that I've seen a burial for a Plantagenet. I've seen burials of Plantagenet kings, but actually buried here is someone from the Plantagenet family. Their name is Plantagenet. And there's an interesting plaque on the floor there, because the last owner of Ashby De La Zouche Castle was involved in London and well known. So people of Spitalfields, which is near Farringdon today, put this plaque down. And she's buried over here with her husband in this wonderful alabaster tomb. Just here you can see some interesting heraldry. It's very much a family chapel. And a Plantagenet on the wall is just behind me. So do subscribe and join next week for another Unbound History.